welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see people here in the chat. It's great to see. Thank you for joining us. Fantastic. Okay, so I'll just wait another moment for people to get started. If they are still waiting to join us. But if you have already joined us, then we can get started just momentarily. This will be a lesson on race in Othello. For those of you who've joined previously, especially this week, I've got a bit of a cold / a little bit under the weather, so apologies for my voice today. It's a little bit raspy, but I've got tissues and I've got some cough drops here, so don't worry about me. Thank you for joining. Just trying to pull up the comment section as well. Okay. Great. So let's get started, as it is now our time. Today we're going to be looking at the theme of race. This is our second, or actually our third theme lesson that we have been looking at so far. And race is kind of one of the biggest themes that comes up, of course, because this is the Shakespeare play in which race really is foregrounded as part of the relationship between the characters, and certainly comes from where the play originated in Cinthio's version, because in Cinthio's version we have the title Desdemona and the Moor, so immediately foregrounding Othello's identity. And Othello actually isn't even named in Cinthio's version, he's just called the Moor, and he fulfills many more of the stereotypical Jacobean / Venetian prejudices of black people. He is much more prone to the violence and monstrosity that in Shakespeare's Othello takes a lot more time and provoking externally to deliver. So, for anyone who's new, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at my EdSpace, and I will be providing the free streams for Othello and many more of our A-level literature texts going forwards. This is not any particular exam board. This will be appropriate for anyone who's studying Othello or anyone who wants to learn more about Othello, because here we're hoping to give you a little bit more depth and breadth than is possible in a normal A-level classroom due to, of course, your timings in a normal schedule of a day. Your workbook, which is something I've made and put together that reflects the information that we have on the slides, is also available in the description of this video so that you'll be able to access it and use it to follow along. Okay, so let's start with a review. So put into the chat anything you know about Othello and race thus far. So if you've been with us since the beginning, which I imagine we've got some people who have been with us for quite a while at this point, then they will know some of these ideas already. So feel free to pop into the chat what you know already about what the colour black was associated with in the Jacobean era, the colour white as well, the contemporary view of blackness in the Jacobean era. So that means the kind of current view of the audience at the time. What contextual factors influence this view? What is miscegenation? And how was miscegenation received in Jacobean society? Okay. So feel free to pop into the chat. I'll give you just a moment to do that, and then I will be able to address what you're looking at as well. Okay, so let's get started. So, what was the colour black associated with in the Jacobean era? Now, I've done a whole hour and a half stream on gender and blackness in the Jacobean era. So for those who've already participated, fantastic. If you haven't seen that, feel free to go and take a look at that first, because it will give you a lot of the ideas that will help us in this. Black in the Jacobean era was associated with devilry. It was associated with demons. It was associated with evil, contamination, moral darkness, and sin. Now, where is all this coming from? This is partly coming from Jacobean Christianity, in which the predominant teachings of the day were very much associating God with light and God with purity. And that we'll get more into that when we take a look at the colour white. But the devil was associated with darkness, not just physical darkness, though he was associated with physical darkness, which is perhaps why there was this fear of unknown spaces like forests and moors during this time, moors being the place in this instance, because there was this seeming lack of control, that humans didn't know the way, and that if they were left in darkness for too long, it could corrupt them. This is also linking with moral darkness, so this idea of being far from God's light and being separate from God. So we are then thinking of this as linked with sin and evil and all of those ideas associated with the devil. If God is light, then the alternative is the devil is associated with blackness. This is also linked to blackness in terms of race at this time as well, because adventurers, colonizers, discoverers were all exploring the world during this time, particularly exploring Africa and the Americas and Asia at this time, and encountering people with different skin tones from the extremely homogenous England at the time. And because the people that they were encountering were, for the most part, not Christian and also not white, they associated these other people with the lack of Christianity, with the lack of moral goodness and guidance that they believed God ascribed to followers of Christianity, and the treatment and prejudice of people with particularly darker skin tones was informed by that. Now, this links to a lot of writing and literature and drama at the time, because devilish figures, figures who were from somewhere other than England, any villains were all often associated with a darker complexion as well, because they were more linked to the devil, and Jacobean England viewed any religion that was not Christianity as evil and devilish as well. So alternatively, the colour white, what was it associated with? It was particularly associated with goodness and purity. It was associated with sanctity. If we're thinking about the virginity tests and femininity within the Jacobean era, we're thinking about this as associated with virginity. So immediately our association with Othello goes to Desdemona and her handkerchief, that trifle light as air, that is spotted with strawberries. There is a very specific reason why that is associated with that colour. We're also thinking of this being aligned with God, with Christianity, with light, and with innocence. So those ideas of cowardice were associated more with femininity because white was associated more with femininity, hence why virgins often dressed in white and why a marriage gown or a wedding dress later was white. We see some negative connotations with white occasionally. For example, in Macbeth, when Lady Macbeth says that her hands are the same colour as Macbeth's, but she would shame to wear a heart so white, because it was also linked with milk, particularly mother's milk, and thus with nourishment. So when they're linking cowardice, for example, with white, or pallor, so someone looking sick, with being white, it was this idea of them being associated with femininity and thus not masculinity. Okay. Contemporary view of blackness here. It was evil, it was dirty, and we will look at quotations from the time. It was contaminated and contaminating. So it was something that could be spread, much like sin could be corrupting the innocent if they weren't careful. Associated with sin as well, and as I said, with monstrosity and with pagan or non-English identities. By pagan, I mean using the Jacobean word for someone who was not Christian. They would have viewed someone who was not Christian as inherently sinful because they weren't saved by God. What contextual factors influence this? Firstly, Christianity, of course, particularly if we're thinking about the time. This was King James I, King James of the King James Bible, and also of he who was trying to rout out anyone who was not following Protestant traditions, and also who was perhaps threatening them by, for example, being associated with witchcraft. Also, the Age of Discovery, as I said, the Age of Discovery in which English, Spanish, French, Dutch explorers were colonizing the rest of the world and writing up these descriptions of their encounters with different groups, and through this they were describing, for sometimes the first time, the other people that they were encountering. So all of Shakespeare and the common Jacobean person would know of people outside of England were the sensationalized press, perhaps when Queen Elizabeth I had visitors from Morocco and from the Ottoman Empire in 1600 and 1601, or from these mystical, magical seeming adventure accounts from travellers. Then, miscegenation. Well, let's add to this before we do that. Prejudice, right? Prejudice and xenophobia. If we're thinking about England as developing its sense of empire, then anyone who is not part of England, not part of the correct and right Jerusalem on earth, and I use huge quotations to say that because I'm quoting what they would have thought, then this would have been something that is anti-English. So when we are thinking of this, we're returning back to who we looked at in our gender and blackness lesson, Edward Said, and this idea of Orientalism, which was his description of England and Europe defining themselves by what they were not, and using the other, so othering anywhere that wasn't where they were, as not only different but incorrect, unholy, and wrong. Then miscegenation. Miscegenation is the description for particularly the progeny or the children of interracial marriages. Due to the view of blackness in Jacobean England, this would have been extremely taboo and transgressive because it would have been threatening the systems of place. For example, the Great Chain of Being, in which everyone in society was ascribed a place by their birth, by their heritage, and they were not meant to move from that. That is then thinking about Othello and Desdemona's marriage, Othello moving up, transgressing his place in the Great Chain of Being. Though he insists he's from nobility, he's still black and not white. So this still is a transgression. And the children of an interracial marriage would have been viewed as entirely different from English people. They would have been rejected and exiled from English society. They would have lived on the fringes of society because they would have been viewed as contaminated or corrupted at the time. How was it received? As I said, taboo, transgressive. There would have been absolute fury and furore at this attempt at miscegenation, which perhaps, as we will see, is why the miscegenation, the potential miscegenation, is doomed from the start if we're thinking about Othello and Desdemona, because Shakespeare, I don't think, would have been able to escape or would able to allow a play to finish with a happy marriage that was a miscegenation, and would have allowed that to continue, because that would have implied that Othello and Desdemona had children who would then be gaining power because they were high in society. I don't think Shakespeare's audience would have allowed that to be the case. So let's think about how race appears in the play. Firstly, we have the Venetians' racism. Right? We have Brabantio calling him a devil. We have Roderigo calling him all types of names and all types of sort of graphic descriptions. We have Iago saying, "I hate them all," right? And them viewing this as justification for public shaming of Othello, of retribution, if we're thinking about Roderigo and Iago, and for exile, particularly for Desdemona, right? Brabantio says essentially that he has no daughter by the end of Act 1 and won't allow her to go back to his house. So first of all that. And it is portrayed as something that is violent, that is continuous, and is deeply entrenched in who the Venetians are because it threatens their way of life. So perhaps we can immediately think of these characters then as the embodiment of not only Venetian prejudice, but also of Jacobean prejudice and Jacobean society, because we have them being so fundamentally and hugely angry that Othello would marry Desdemona, would even think to. And this is interestingly as well, right? Because this suggests that they are personally affected by this marriage. Brabantio arguably is, because he, quote unquote, loses his daughter, and Roderigo because he loses the person he wants to marry. But Iago takes this marriage personally as well. In Cinthio's version, he's in love with Desdemona and so gets revenge on Othello in order to have Desdemona for his own. But in Shakespeare's version, it seems like he's just angry about it. He's offended by this marriage. And that becomes clear through the way he talks about it, right? He speaks about it in extremely graphic, racialized, sexual terms, which are dehumanizing and devaluing and distancing from Desdemona and Othello immediately. How else does it appear? Well, we can think about Desdemona, right? Is Desdemona, who chooses to marry a black man, as Othello himself says, she knew who she was marrying, she saw my face. And Desdemona herself says, I saw his visage in my mind, so I saw his face in my mind. And as we said in our previous lesson on power, when we were thinking about the power of women, this is an extremely transgressive thing for her to do. She is rejecting everything she knows, everything she has for Othello. So it speaks to her deep love for him, perhaps her naivete, right, that she thinks she can do this and get away with it. Perhaps it's also her rebelliousness, right? And many scholars have made much of her rebelliousness here, that she's willing to kind of, much more than Othello, risk it all for love and for a happy ending. It's her who wants to go to Cyprus. It's her who apparently seeks out Othello and flirts with him and courts him. Also, we're thinking about her as, in the Venetians' eyes, perhaps corrupted, right? This is the reason for their sexual imagery against her, is that she is being topped. She's being made the beast with two backs, right? So there's something horrifying to the Jacobeans, to the Venetians, about her marriage, because it is sexual, right? It's expected that a married couple would have sex. But also because she is portrayed otherwise as this paragon of purity. She is white personified. So for her to be white and Othello to be black, the Venetians suggest means that she is corrupted by him. Not that her skin as such will change, but that his blackness and his who he is will rub off on her and corrupt her. And that is why she has fallen from this Madonna to this whore in the Madonna-whore dichotomy. How else can we think about this? We can think about the other characters, like Cassio and the Duke, who seem to disregard Othello's race in favor of other attributes, particularly his military experience, and Othello says as well, his nobility, perhaps. And Cassio never engages in this. He loves Othello, as does the Duke, who even says, as we will see, that his own daughter would have fallen for the stories that Othello tells. So that means he's considered this idea of Othello as perhaps not a son-in-law to himself, but as someone who could possibly marry someone white. And the Duke says as well, he's more fair than black. So this idea that he is much more like the other Venetians than Iago, Brabantio, or Roderigo would say. How else can we see this? We can see that perhaps race is one of Othello's insecurities. It makes him an outsider. And we saw in our last lesson, he says, haply for I am black and have not the soft parts of conversation that chamberers have. This is his reason for why Desdemona would leave him. The same with him speaking to the court in Act 1. He says, forgive me, I'm rude in speech, having spent so much time in the military and not in society. So he views himself as an outsider. Now we can look at this in a couple of different ways. Is this then that he feels he can't keep Desdemona? If an insider threatens his marriage? Because as we said in our lesson on Cassio, Brabantio, and Roderigo, Cassio has to be somewhat threatening in this way. Not that he's a threatening character, but it has to be reasonable that Desdemona would fall in love with Cassio, or would cheat on Othello with Cassio. So he has to be this beloved insider who could possibly pull Desdemona away. Does Othello internalize the racism of the Venetians? And especially of Iago? Perhaps, right? And that he acts along these lines because Iago knows how to manipulate Othello and says, why would she have chosen you if she was in her right mind? Why wouldn't she get bored of you? And says to Roderigo as well, when she tires of the sport, she'll be disgusted. In other words, when she tires of having sex with Othello, which is clearly what she desires, then she'll get tired of him and she'll be sickened by him because she is everything that he is not. So really, in a way, we must focus on Iago's racism in particular because it is used as fuel for revenge. And it works, as we can see. Because all of this, these two ideas here, depend on the stereotype that Othello perhaps embodies. By the end of the play. He is continuously called monstrous throughout the play even from the beginning. Is he arguably monstrous at the end of the play? We could say so. M11 said he tries to fit in this society and their social rules. Exactly. So there's this idea of power that has to do with society and race here. Absolutely. And we have, hello Ayara, welcome. We have as well this idea of Othello's trajectory here from the subversion of the stereotype at the beginning. He is not the stereotype at all at the beginning. He is everything that Iago Rodrigo Brabantio says he is not. But then he becomes this monstrous being by the end that perhaps is closer to this stereotype. So here we can think of so many different ways in which we can cover race here. Even perhaps this idea of race here dooming the marriage, as we said in our previous lesson as well. So race and fate here. Marriage. Apologies. Dooming the marriage here because there's no way that Shakespeare's audience would allow this to continue. It had to lead to their death. And particularly for Desdemona, I can't see her escaping this play, can you? We can also think about, just in concentration, of these motifs of light and darkness across the play, being linked not only with race, but also with monstrosity, with truth, with fear, with appearance versus reality. And also these motifs then of sight and monstrosity. So there's so much to cover here, right? So let's take a look at some different lines of arguments in just a moment. Firstly, a little bit more about race and miscegenation in the Jacobean era. So I'm going to read this out, and anything that stands out to you, any questions, anything that sounds interesting, anything you would want to borrow to include in your own work going forwards, please feel free to put in the chat. So views of race in Elizabethan and Jacobean England were complex. To start with, anxieties developed by biblical imagery led people to associate blackness with evil and devilry. It is widely believed that Queen Elizabeth I signed 2 edicts expelling Moors from England in 1599 and 1601 in response to fears that Moors would take the jobs of English people. However, this belief has recently been challenged, especially as Elizabeth's own household included several black servants, and the Queen entertained diplomats from Morocco in 1600 as part of an ambassadorial visit from the Ottoman Empire. Despite this, stereotypes and prejudice of black and African people spread in England, possibly stemming from accounts of conquest during the Age of Discovery and biblical teachings of Noah's son, Ham, who is believed to be the ancestor of all African people. So I've covered Ham a little bit previously, but Ham was one of Noah's sons who was sent to different places to repopulate the earth. However, Ham committed a cardinal sin in walking in and seeing his father either naked or committing an indiscretion, and was cursed. Him and his bloodline were cursed to be linked with hard labor and suffering. And because Ham was black, this biblical story then associated and aligned blackness, sin, evil, suffering, and labor all together. Now, there were also stereotypes about the working classes, that they were the Hams of the earth as well. So perhaps could this have justified in part enslavement and the treatment of working classes, though regardless of race? Yes. But certainly there are elements of this that leak into Jacobean society. Miscegenation. Miscegenation describes the interracial marriages and sexual relationship between black and white people. As sex within marriage was viewed exclusively as a process for reproduction, the concept of mixed-race children was often viewed as a type of corruption of the white race. Mixed-race children consequently occupied a third space, as shown in the quotation below. So, thinkers, chroniclers, and philosophers of the 16th century asked, why were Africans black? Was the blackness of Africans temporary or permanent, congenital and inherited? What about children born to interracial couples? Would they be black, white, or some other hue? So this idea coming from David Olusoga's Black and British, a fantastic text about the history of blackness, particularly within England and the UK. So a couple of bits here, right? Firstly, black as politicized, right? Black as the other, especially aligned with the Ottoman Empire and with this kind of external threat to England, as we've seen when we studied a little bit more about the Ottoman Empire. It's also associated with this Christianity, and it's associated with these biblical stories from the Old Testament. Then thinking about this third space, and perhaps you've come across a question for Othello on isolation. Could we think of Othello and Desdemona themselves as isolated due to them being forced into this third space in which they are rejected in some ways by both societies, by white society and by Othello's seeming background, as he only mentions occasionally, that they wouldn't be welcome in other spaces. So perhaps Cyprus is a space for them to exist together because it itself is a kind of third space that's not Venice, and because it's colonized is not quite the other either. This is a reproduction of John Blank, who was a Tudor trumpeter as well, who served in the court as a trumpeter. Now, where did Shakespeare derive his presentation of blackness? Now, from all of these places, of course, but if we think about the texts that he might have read, Leo Africanus's Geographical History of Africa is perhaps something that he's read, and David Olusoga concludes that he almost definitely read, based on his both presentation of this but also subversion of these tropes in Othello. And this is from this 1550 text that was circulated in England a little bit later, closer to 1600, when Shakespeare would have been writing Othello. They, black Africans, are very proud and high-minded and wonderfully addicted unto wrath. So, firstly, this idea of pride. If we think of Othello, reputation, we're thinking of we're thinking of his reaction to the threat. We're thinking of his explosiveness, not only to Desdemona and volatility, but also with Iago and Cassio, when he demotes Cassio, when he falls onto the ground screaming and yelling with Iago, and sort of has a high temper in these instances. High-minded, interesting as well, right? We think of Othello, and certainly he seems to think of himself as someone who is esoteric, right? He is saved the most kind of carefully crafted language. Is that perhaps because he's more aware of his role as an outsider, so he's extra careful of his language in Venetian court? Possibly. He certainly thinks of himself as more powerful than Desdemona in several ways. So if we're thinking of this in terms of power dynamic, that might be interesting, right? And perhaps linking to pride, this idea that he is right in his own mind, right? He views himself as correct. Hi, Nilda's crying over AQA, welcome. So this idea that he, once he is convinced of something, is unwilling to interrogate himself, is unself-aware or uncritical in himself. And then woefully addicted unto wrath. This idea is he is addicted unto wrath. This is interesting, right? Because Othello at the beginning is being completely attacked by Brabantio at the start. He's being railed on by Brabantio and by the others who are trying to rile him up. And he's so calm and collected. He is absolutely courteous at the beginning. He's gentlemanly, as he himself describes. But then when his ire is provoked, or as he said in his final speech, wrought to the extreme, then he is wrathful. He is bloodthirsty. He is vengeful. Right? So it's not that he's addicted unto wrath, but he becomes unreasonable when provoked. Is this Shakespeare playing on Jacobean stereotypes, or is he subverting them? It's tough to say. Is he using these stereotypes to engage his audience, or is he trying to present him as more than black, as any man would do at this time? Is he subverting or reinforcing these stereotypes? I think you could argue to a certain extent both, but I think he's much more doing this because despite what we've just spoken about here, the fact that Shakespeare is giving this credence, giving this nobility, giving this gentlemanly courteousness to Othello, and using the character of Iago to show the influence of the embodiment of evil on a human character, perhaps is showing, as I think it's Bradley who says, this is not the domain of any one race, right? This actually transcends racial boundaries. Now let's take a look at what criticism focuses on when we're talking about race. Since roughly the 80s and 90s, race has become the forefront of the criticism about Othello. Perhaps justifiably, because previously it was through racial bias, through stereotype, as Coleridge, Leavis, etc. rely on and reinforce racist stereotypes of black people in their descriptions and in their analysis. Whereas more recently we've had post-colonial theory, we've had critical race theory in order to unpick the racial identity here. Neil says, it would be almost as difficult to say whether its racial anxieties are ones that the play discovers or implants in an audience as to say whether jealousy is something that Iago discovers or implants in Othello. So, what is it saying? This is saying these racial anxieties, this expectation that this marriage is doomed and that Othello is going to become monstrous, is that Shakespeare prodding at his own society's stereotypes and revealing them and saying, look what's embedded under this culture, your own prejudices about where this was going to go? Or if he's actually putting these in by having all of this language to stir us up and to turn us against this marriage, perhaps turn us against Othello. Are we, because we're aligned much more with Iago, because he's speaking to us more, because he's interacting with us more, because in a way we're complicit with him, is he guiding us into these racial anxieties that he then wants to unpack? Up to you to think. Then Goethe says, a wonderful peep show wherein the history of the world runs its course on the invisible thread of time. This is interesting, right? Because we have this idea of Shakespeare capturing in Othello this microcosm of racial anxieties at the time and is capturing it all in the hour and a half it takes to run this play. He's cementing for us this reaction to someone other. And this perhaps makes sense with the different productions that I've mentioned before in the introduction to Othello, because there have been many instances over time when there has been a politically charged and politically reflective production of Othello. So in the 80s in apartheid South Africa, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s in America, every decade of which was portraying an Othello that was slightly different. And Othellos were only being captured and portrayed by black actors in perhaps the late 1800s or early 1900s. Interesting. Do black people have likewise prejudice against white people? It's hard to say, and it's definitely hard to speak from my experience as a white woman here. What I will say is, when we're thinking about white people's prejudice against black people, there is a system of power that enables that prejudice to become more harmful to black people than otherwise. So I'm thinking then about white supremacy, the systems of power, the institutions of society, if we're thinking about Jacobean England, ensured that whiteness was given power and blackness was disempowered. So perhaps Shakespeare is trying to reveal that inequality, right? And to reveal that his audiences are perhaps not as inclusive, Christian, accepting, forgiving as they would or should be or claim to be. Now, where else does criticism focus? Karen Newman, who I've quoted before in And Wash the Ethiop White, Femininity and the Monstrous in Othello. Amazing article unpicking femininity and monstrosity and linking it to race and miscegenation here. It talks about rhetorical miscegenation. So all of that language of Shakespeare, of Othello and Desdemona having sex, and thinking about this mixing and miscegenation of the two in the language of the play. We don't ever see them almost even embracing in the play. But we do have quite a lot of black and white mixing in the language of the play, and these fears that Iago and Roderigo provoke in Brabantio are due to the fact that they are convincingly suggestive of this taboo of miscegenation. As she says as well, miscegenation is an issue not only on the level of plot but also of language for linked opposition. So this is the idea of black and white in the play in language being so important to the meaning of the play, to the presentation of race in the play as well. Newman as well, this isn't her opinion, but rather her quoting from earlier scholarship. For Coleridge, Levis, etc., the Black Moor and the fair Desdemona's marriage is unthinkable. So the idea of their marriage being so transgressive that it is something beyond the pale here. And black and white and their cultural associations characterize the play's discourse. So black and white being fundamental to the language of the play again, and also to its plot and significance here. And Kim Hall as well, great critic to talk about race here. Dark and light become in the early modern period the conduit through which the English begin to formulate the notions of self and other, so well known in Anglo-American discourse. So what does this mean? This means that dark and light, as I said, being linked with Christianity and England and purity and goodness, being associated then with the self, and the other being linked with darkness, and this being used to justify the language, the presentation, the treatment of real people in both Anglo-England and American discourses here, all the way through. And as she says as well, earlier ideas about good and bad were imposed onto and fought out against ideas about differences in skin color. So this goes to show that there is not that racism is a social construct, right? It is an idea created by people about the different associations with good and bad. And because England was an empire whose ideas, religion, beliefs, social structure was spread around the world through colonization and empire, that meant that skin color across the world became associated with different concepts of good and bad. And these became the lines through which society defined itself. Newman as well says, and this is more focused on miscegenation, much of the disgust, think about that, that's a really heavy word for critics, literary critics to use, about previous literary critics, about this important play. M11, the misinterpretation of Christianity, absolutely. Of course, this is not thinking about the true beliefs, but rather what Jacobean Christianity was used to do and to justify. Certainly, it was a misinterpretation of the true values of Christianity. I would absolutely say so and agree with you there. So much of the disgust Rymer, Coleridge, and other critics betray comes not from the fact of Othello's individual blackness, but from the relation of that blackness to Desdemona's fair purity. Coleridge calls it monstrous. Embedded in commentaries on the play, which seek to ward off Othello's blackness, is the fear of miscegenation, and particularly the white man's fear of the union of black man with white woman. Such commentators occupy the rhetorical position of Rodrigo Brabantio Iniago, who view the marriage of Othello and Desdemona as against all sense and nature. I'll refer to all things of sense, whether a maid so tender, fair, and happy would ever have to incur a general mock, run from her guardage to the city bosom of such a thing as thou. So, what are we seeing here? Newman is aligning the very racialized interpretations of Othello from Rymer, Coleridge, and earlier critics with the position of these characters in the play, who we are positioned against, right? We're not sympathetic to these characters. And Newman is saying that this then reveals a real issue in our real society that shows the racialized anxieties of society at the time. How does Jacobean fear of miscegenation appear in the text? Through these characters, through this racialized language, through this sexualized language as well. And how might this relate to the timing and setting of the play? Because of these fears of Jacobean England at the time, because of the frenzy around Christianity and fear of external threat as well. Now, the trajectory of the perception and presentation of Othello's race across the play. So we're looking at the same Freytag's pyramid as we did in our power lesson, but here we're thinking about Othello and Desdemona are happily married, right? But we can see that Cassio and the Duke support this, whereas Brabantio, Roderigo, Iago are against and outraged. And this outrage comes as racism. Then we could say perhaps this is the court scene where all of this comes out, right? And this meets this. This is imposed upon this. And then for Othello, perhaps, his marriage is redefined in society's eyes. And then perhaps Othello's fears grow, provoked by Iago here. In this culmination, which I will always argue is Act 3, Scene 3, the temptation scene. Oops. We have Iago saying to Othello, why would she choose you if she could choose anyone else, if she spurned everyone else? She's transgressive. You can't trust her. So this is where Othello then begins to change and become different from himself. These fears perhaps of being rejected, of cuckoldry, which for him in particular would be much more harmful, as we've seen in previous lessons, than it would be for him if he were white. And this fear of Desdemona's transgression. And then we have his descent. And here we have him becoming the stereotype that these characters embedded him in the beginning and Iago reinforced going forwards. And this descent into monstrosity until the point in which Othello sees himself as evil, as monstrous, and as we saw in our last lesson, as the Turk and the dog that deserves punishment and damnation. Which is what these characters, again, said in the beginning. Transgression means breaking social, moral, or legal boundaries. So breaking the boundaries of society, breaking the rules of society. So in a way, this becomes almost cyclical in structure, right? Because the language of these characters at the beginning becomes Iago's language, which becomes Othello's language, which then leads to Othello viewing himself the way that Brabantio and Iago and Roderigo view him in the beginning. So let's look a little bit at this in our next portion of the lesson. Here first, the racism of the Venetians. So I'm going to read out, and then whatever stands out to you, feel free to put in the chat any interpretations you have, any questions you have, any parts you'd like me to go over in particular as well. Roderigo says, what a full fortune does the thick lips owe if he can carry it thus? Firstly, the racial epithet there. This is relying on stereotypes. This is racist, racialized language. And as we looked at in our last lesson, this is his reference to Desdemona, who he supposedly loves. So the dehumanization both of Desdemona and Othello, perhaps because he now views Othello as someone who's stolen from him, he views Desdemona as fallen from this purity into the whore of the Madonna-whore dichotomy. Then Iago, and I bless the mark, his more ships ancient. So this is kind of playing on words, but using it on racialized language, calling him only the more, not Othello or the general, or his leaderships, his lordships. He's calling him his more ships, which is a play on words, but on racialized terms. And Rodrigo says, by heaven, I would rather be his hangman. So you'd rather kill Othello than follow him. So again, we have these ideas associated with villainy, with dissent, with foolishness, and with death here. Iago, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Here, here, an old black ram, this idea of animalistic language, white ewe, the idea of racism here, with this idea of him covering her, perhaps contaminating her, certainly this idea of kind of animalistic breeding that links to miscegenation, definitely, but also links to this idea of corruption, lack of consent, links to this kind of bestial imagery, right? Iago continues with this, the devil will make a grandsire of you. The devil will make you a grandfather, he says to Brabantio. So then we're seeing devil, and again, the idea of miscegenation here. Iago, again, your daughter, so the possessive language, think about that in terms of Brabantio, ownership, possession. Your daughter and the more are now making the beast with two backs, another euphemism, though it's hardly, it seems more graphic than just saying they're having sex. This idea of the beast with two backs, they're becoming something bestial again. So then there must be a pattern of bestial language here, bestial imagery, graphic sexual imagery that suggests not only Othello's corruptive nature, but also Desdemona's corruption. Iago saying, your daughter covered with a Barbary horse. So the Barbary coast was a phrase used to describe the northernmost coast of Africa at the time. Not a phrase used anymore. But not only is this racial image included, but this idea of him being a horse. So again, something that's studding, that's breeding, right? And the fact that this is not just bestial imagery, but ideas of bestiality here, that Desdemona is having sex with an animal here, really does make this sound horrible. Why is that? Because it's informed by racism here. 11, could their prejudice not just be towards black people in this case, but towards any different people? Yes, definitely, though there is a racialized element here. And you'll have your nephews neigh to you, so then your children, your grandchildren, your nephews, your relations will be animals, will be horses, or this kind of unholy horse-human hybrid. That again suggests that Desdemona's and thus Brabantio's bloodlines will be contaminated by this blood. Brabantio says, O thou foul thief, where hast thou stowed my daughter? Damned as thou art, thou hast enchanted her. For I'll refer me to all things of sense. If she were in chains of magic, were not bound, whether a maid so tender, fair, and happy would have ever to incur a general muck, run from her guardage to the sooty bosom of a thing, such a thing as thou, to fear, not to delight. So there's so much here. Firstly, the idea of Othello as a thief who has stolen from Brabantio. Immediately that foregrounds Desdemona's role here as transactional, as an object. Again, in his manipulation, 100% M11. Because now we can see from Rodrigo and Iago's language, they've stirred up Brabantio, and we're seeing him reflected in this language. This idea of him as a thief, as damned, which carries much more weight than it does to us, perhaps. This idea of being damned to hell. So you are destined for hell. You've enchanted her. Notice the referential strategies as well. He doesn't refer to Othello as his name, even though supposedly they had a prior relationship. And thou is actually the informal language for you. You was more formal at this time. Thou suggests a power dynamic in which Brabantio is on top and Othello is below him. This idea of enchantment, so associated then blackness with witchcraft, as well as with hell, with thievery and evil and crime. Then in chains of magic we're not bound. It's this idea that he's stolen and forcibly taken Desdemona, and it would be impossible for someone so tender, fair, notice here, then the juxtaposition between Othello and Desdemona's relation. Here, this perhaps links with this here, and this motif of whiteness associated with Desdemona would have ever, to incur a general mock. We spoke about this with power, but thinking about this as a public humiliation for Brabantio, and run from her guardage, so from her protection. Thus that Othello is something that needs to be protected from, to the sooty bosom of such a thing as thou. Firstly, sooty. What is soot? Soot is ashes. Soot is linked with then fire. Soot is black. And so this idea not only of hellish imagery perhaps, but also of contamination. If you touch soot, if you touch fire ash, it gets on you, right? And it stains your clothing perhaps, and thus it's spread. So this idea then of contamination here, that perhaps links to this graphic imagery of bestiality from before. Desdemona is being corrupted here. And then we're thinking of such a thing as thou. The dehumanization here is stark, right? And something that should be feared, not delighted. So he's portraying Othello as almost like a boogeyman, right? Some kind of monster. And this idea that this should inspire fear for Desdemona, that she should fear him. Brabantio as well says, to fall in love with what she feared to look on. This idea of her being, should be being afraid to see him because he is black, because he would, in their minds, have traits associated with devilry. And this is, we'll see later, becomes the language of Othello. Rodrigo says the gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. So this is the idea of she is in the grotesque arms of a lustful Moor. This idea of lasciviousness linked with blackness here, this overt sexuality, this pagan sexuality that was not confined by the restrictions of Jacobean Christianity, purity, marriage, monogamy, etc. So for her to be in this kind of tight embrace of his. Then Iago says later to Rodrigo, her eye must be fed. So again, we have this idea of feeding here that we've looked at previously. And what delight shall she have to look on the devil? When the blood is made dull with the act of sport, there should be a game to inflame it and give satiety a fresh appetite, loveliness in favour, sympathy in years, manners and beauties, all of which the Moor is defective in. Now, for want of these required conveniences, her delicate tenderness will find itself abused, begin to heave the gorge, disrelish and abhor the Moor. Very nature will instruct her in it and compel her to some second choice. So what is Iago saying here? He's saying she must be continually fed love or reinforced in her love by seeing the person. How could she possibly continue to love someone who, in our minds, is the devil? When she is bored with sex, so blood made dull with the act of sport, when she's bored of having sex, will need to inflame her blood again to turn her on, or incite her lust again with something new, a fresh appetite, loveliness and favor. So all of these nice things, being gentlemanly, being a similar age, having good manners, being beautiful, all of which the Moor is defective in. Othello doesn't say this before, but he says it later in the play, that he is perhaps ugly to her and doesn't excite her, is too old, all of these things. So Iago is saying this, that Othello has none of the reasons for Desdemona to stay. And as such, she will begin to feel abused by this marriage, taken for granted. She'll begin to try and push away from it, disrelish, and hate him. So she'll begin to hate Othello when she really has to deal with the fact that he is black. Very nature will instruct her in it. So she, by her nature, will be driven away from Othello. She'll be disgusted by him. This is very intensely racist and is also an underused quotation. I would say it's very easy to use this quotation to then project into and foreshadow Othello's own insecurities. Then we have Emilia, who, though is powerful as a woman and transgressive as a woman, perhaps, is also imbibing the same racist views. She says, the more angel she and you, the blacker devil. This is her talking to Othello once she has seen Desdemona's been killed. Emilia also says she was too fond of her most filthy bargain. So again, this idea of contamination and dirtiness linked with blackness. And Emilia, the Moor hath killed my mistress. So again, the language of the other Venetian characters, whilst also kind of lining into this stereotype of the previous ideas of him being this stereotype that Brabantio, Iago, Roderigo feared, that he would be someone who would kill his wife. Orkin says, it is Iago, the white man, who's portrayed as amoral and anti-Christian, essentially savage towards that which he envies or resents, and cynical in his attitude to love. For him, merely lust of the blood and permission of the will. So interestingly then, Orkin is saying that Iago is presented as the one who is evil and savage, because he's presenting sex in this way, because he's speaking in this way, because he's so obviously evil. Orkin also says, perhaps nowhere else in drama is the Elizabethan faculty for projection onto the other so well illustrated as in Iago's imaginings about Othello's alleged promiscuity. So this idea of projection, Iago is actually projecting onto Othello what he wants, what his suppressed desires. Orkin suggests that Iago is projecting either a jealousy of Othello, that he wants to be with Desdemona subconsciously, that he is jealous of Othello's masculinity in that he can have this paragon of virtue, and perhaps had Emilia as well. Or perhaps he's projecting this idea of he wants to either be Othello or be with Othello, these repressed sexual desires for Othello. Levis says, his colour we are certainly to take as much, emphasising the disparity of the match. This is Levis saying that his blackness is the reason for the way that they are presented as different in the other speaker's language. Levis also says, he's self-centered and self-regarding satisfactions, pride, sensual possessiveness, appetite, and strong sensuality with ugly, vindictive jealousy. So Levis's language is racist as well towards Othello, but if we're thinking of this, he embodies, as Newman says, the same associations with blackness that Othello, Roderigo, and Brabantio have. So we can still use his criticism to support this idea of this is what the other characters associated with blackness at the time. Coleridge describes their marriage as something monstrous. Clearly, the other characters do too. So you can use this to support the idea of the racism of the Venetians links to this idea of the marriage as monstrous. Dr. Johnson of the dictionary describes the ending of the play as dreadful, not to be endured. It's this idea of this marriage culminating in this tragedy with the murders, etc., as not to be endured, this idea of being pushed too far. And Neil, one of the most terrifying things about Othello is its racial poison seemed so casually concocted, as if racism was something that Iago made up as he went along. We're not even sure if Iago believes everything he's saying, or whether he's just holding up a mirror to society and saying, as M11 said, in his manipulation, what he's trying to get the other characters to think. However, the characterization of Othello subverts contemporary views of blackness. Let's see how Othello subverts or resists the stereotypes here. Othello says, "Let him do his spite. My services which I have done the Signori shall outtongue his complaints. Yet 'tis to know, which, when I know that boasting is an honour, I shall promulgate. I fetch my life and being from men of royal siege, and my demerits may speak unbonneted to as proud a fortune as this that I have reached. For no Iago, but that I love the gentle Desdemona, I would not my unhoused free condition put into circumscription and confine for the sea's worth, but look what lights come yond." So this is Othello in Act 1, Scene 2, being warned by Iago that Brabantio is furious and has found out. And Othello says, let him do his spite. So immediately, he's like, let him do what he can. What I have done as general will supersede any of these complaints. Then he's saying as well that he is from royalty and that he loves gentle Desdemona and would not give up his freedom for anything, for the sea's worth. Okay, so this is very much in contrast to the monstrous enchanter that Brabantio portrays. He's like, okay, he's calm, he's reflective, he's considerate, he's noble, and he's loving here, all of which are in contrast to the stereotype. Othello also says, "My parts, my title, and my perfect soul shall manifest me rightly." Though this is a little bit braggadocious, we're not thinking of someone who here is the kind of brutal pagan that the other characters associate with witchcraft and evil. In fact, Othello talks about his soul much more than any other Shakespeare character. Perhaps this is because he's a convert. Perhaps this is because he's aware that he is known as the Moor despite being Christian. But perhaps he is, in a way, more conscious of his lack of sin here because he is so associated with sin. Othello also says, "Let her have your voice." This is in the court scene when people are interrupting Desdemona, and Brabantio in particular is saying, "Fetch her home, I'm taking her home," etc. And Othello says, "Let her speak in public." So he's actually enabling her to speak. He is not controlling, he's not lascivious, he's not overly proud. He is happy for her to speak her mind in court. He is enabling her to do this, in a way almost proto-feminist, right? The Duke says, "A noble signor, if virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." So the Duke is saying that Othello is virtuous and far more fair because of his virtue. So if his virtue was matched up with his skin colour, he would be very white. In other words, so the Duke then is swapping these ideas of fairness and blackness by associating blackness, Othello's blackness, with his virtue, so defending him. Othello also says, my story being done, she gave me for my pains a world of sighs. She swore in faith 'twas strange, 'twas passing strange, 'twas pitiful, 'twas wondrous pitiful. She wished she had not heard it, yes, she wished that heaven had made her such a man. She thanked me and bade me, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint I spake. She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. This only is the witchcraft I have used. Here comes the lady, let her witness it. The Duke says, I think this tale would win my daughter too. So interestingly, Othello is talking about telling stories at Brabantio's house and Desdemona reacting them. And she is pitiful of him and amazed by him and says she wished that she could be like a man like him. Interestingly, if we're thinking of the transgression there that we've looked at previously, thanked me and bade me, she said essentially, if any of your friends love me, have them tell that story and I'll fall in love with them. Upon this hint I spake. So he's saying that she was the one who gave me the hint that she was in love with me, and thus I could voice my love for her. She loved me, I loved her. This is the only witchcraft. The fact that we both loved each other was me telling my story, and it was so convincing that she fell in love with me. And again, let her witness it. So let her testify to the fact, not silencing her the way so many other Shakespeare characters do. I'm thinking Petruchio, for example, in The Taming of the Shrew. Initially as well, when Brabantio says she deceived her father and may thee, Othello initially responds, my life upon her faith. So I trust her with my life, in other words. Again, not the sexualized, clasping, seductive Moor in the first part, but rather a faithful, loyal, courteous, gentlemanly, noble Othello who lets Desdemona speak much more than her father does. Othello also says, for she had eyes and chose me. This idea that she knew what I looked like and she married me. She knew who I was. She chose this clear-heartedly, with full knowledge. I didn't trick her at all. And Othello also says that he's not easily jealous, but being wrought, perplexed in the extreme. So he's saying he's not normally jealous, but he was pushed to the extremes, which is why he acted the way he did at the end. As Orkin says, he's the antithesis of the stereotypical. Orkin also says Shakespeare's Othello is invested with the prerequisites of nobility. He's a great soldier. He possesses a lofty vision, and Shakespeare gives to him the richest language in the play. This is all subverting the contemporary stereotypes of blackness. Orkin also says it's precipitated not by any innate barbarism of his own, but by the barbarism of Iago. So here we're saying that Othello's monstrosity is not from within. It's not provoked from within. It is Iago who is the monster here. The one thing his violence confirms is that if nobility and valor, like depravity, are not the monopoly of any color, then neither is the angry destructiveness that is born of hurt and betrayal. So this is the idea that, okay, if being noble and being brave are not just for one race, then neither are the destructive evils of hurt and betrayal. So in other words, this would happen to anyone of any race. His race has nothing to do with it. And Brandy says, nearly faultless heroes whose strength and virtue are turned against him. So here again, we have this innocent, subversive, pure, good, loyal, faithful Othello, nearly faultless, who are turned against by an evil external influence. Now let's see Othello's own internalized racism. So this is from the court scene. Othello, rude am I in my speech, and little blessed with this soft phrase of peace, for For these arms of mine had 7 years pith, till now some 9 moons wasted, they have used their dearest action in the tented field. So here he's saying that he has not got the same speech and powers of language that the other courtiers does. This seems ironic and perhaps a little bit self-effacing, because he clearly can speak beautifully. But it seems he's perhaps aware of that as a stereotype. And that he hasn't, until 9 months ago, spent any time for 7 years anywhere other than on the battlefield. Othello also says, not from mine own weak merits will I draw the smallest fear or doubt of her revolt, for she had eyes and chose me. So he does say that he has his own weak merits, but he's saying it won't be because of that she'll revolt, because she chose me. So again, this idea of he's aware of his own weaknesses, but he thinks that Desdemona will not leave him for that. Later, this is in Act 2, Scene 1, he says, if it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, for I fear my soul hath her content so absolute that not another comfort like this succeeds in unknown fate. Desdemona replies, the heavens forbid, but that our loves and comforts should increase, even as our days do grow. So this idea that when he is reunited with Desdemona in Cyprus, he's saying, I wish I could die now, because it would be when I'm the happiest I've ever been and ever could be, because I feel I can't be this happy without bad things happening in the future. Foreshadowing, right? Perhaps of Othello's own insecurity, right? He's aware he can't maintain this. He's perhaps aware of his own doom. Whereas Desdemona says, oh, don't say this kind of thing. I hope our love and comforts will increase every day. So she's much more positive about it, whereas Othello seems much more that this love is precarious. Then, when she is accused, Othello says, her name that was as fresh as Dian's visage is now begrimed and black as mine own face. As fresh as Aphrodite's face, so as white as that, is now begrimed and black as mine own face. So now thinking of her corruption and sin being associated with his own skin colour. Okay? So thinking then of himself, perhaps, this internalized racism. Then we see him becoming this stereotype a little bit. I'll tear her all to pieces. Othello says, and yet how nature erring from itself. This is him speaking of her resisting her own nature by picking him. So very differently from this, for she had eyes and chose me, we can see his descent already in this doubt that she's now resisting her nature rather than going with it. And Othello again, in one of the perhaps most famous quotations, haply for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, or for I'm declined into the vale of years, yet that's not much, she's gone. I'm abused, and my relief must be to loathe her. O curse of marriage, that we can call these delicate creatures ours, and not their appetites. I'd rather be a toad and live upon the vapour of a dungeon than keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses. Yet 'tis the plague of great ones, prerogative as they less than the base. 'Tis destiny unshunnable like death. So this idea then of saying, well, it's probably because I'm black. That's the first thing he says. So then it's seeming that he has internalized this racism of the Venetians, and he's using it as justification for Desdemona's infidelity. And he says, maybe because I'm older, but he says, but that's not much. So he disregards that. It's really because she's black. She's gone. Happy for I'm black, she's gone. That is how he views it. And he says that he can't control her. It's such a shame he can't control her appetites. I'd rather be a toad, which is another villainous character, a familiar for witches at the time, so a devilish animal. Live on the vapour of a dungeon, then keep a corner, then only be able to have a piece of what I love rather than having her all to myself. There's a plague of great ones, prerogative as they are less than the base. 'Tis destiny unshunnable like death. Here is interesting because he's saying it is the bad fortune, and sticking with the motif of poison and plague and pestilence here, of great men, that they are attacked this way and taken down this way more than common people. It's destiny that this would have happened. So then again, he's viewing his own marriage, his own happiness as fated to doom, What does that tell us? That he doesn't feel he deserves her, perhaps. And then at the end, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe. And say behind that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus. And then this is where Othello falls on his sword or stabs himself. Look at the comparisons he makes to himself. He's describing himself as a base Indian, as a malignant and turbaned Turk, and as a circumcised dog who is stabbed and killed like this. This is suggesting that his transformation then is complete and that he has become this villainous, malicious threat to Venice, to the state that the other characters view him as. This turbaned Turk, based in just again this idea of witchcraft, and dog really does go back almost to Act 1 with the language of Iago and Roderigo and Brabantio. As Orkin says, Iago exploits Othello's position as outsider to Venetian custom. This seems very evident in his own language. As soldier as well as stranger, Othello is well aware of the difference in behaviour between himself and the wealthy Curl Darlings of whom Brabantio speaks. Wealthy Curl Darlings as the other quarters of, or suitors of, Desdemona. So this juxtaposition then between Othello and those others, between black and white, again is important. Lerner says that Othello is reduced to stammering bestiality. That's here, right? So he internalizes this racism and becomes the stereotype again. He becomes a stammering beast that actually is rude in speech, as he himself self-effacingly says at the beginning. In time it's not true, but then it becomes true. Robeson says, and this is Paul Robeson, who acted as Othello in the 30s, 40s and 50s, is a tragedy of racial conflict, and the fact that he is an alien among white people makes his mind work more quickly. He feels dishonor more deeply. His color heightens the tragedy. So here, this idea of because he's an outsider, because he's an other, this is why he acts so much more quickly. 2 days of marriage and his marriage is destroyed because he is already precarious in his position in society. And De Luca says, the colour of Othello's skin is obviously a crucial factor in his downfall because his visibly alien racial identity makes him and his bride far more vulnerable to the machinations of Iago than if he were an equally accomplished and indispensable white man. Their defiance against Venetian taboo, against such marriage, locks them from the outset into a defensive posture. Here, right? He's defensive, he's fearful of the fate, which predisposes Othello to the insecurity and doubt that grips him so swiftly at Iago's prompting. So this idea that he is expecting something to go wrong here, and thus is immediately able to believe that something would, as we can see here. Let's look at Desdemona's view, though, of Othello's race. Desdemona says, my noble father, I do perceive here a divided duty. For you I am bound for life and education. My life and education both do learn me how to respect you. You are the lord of duty. I am hitherto, or continuously, still your daughter. But here's my husband. And so much duty as my mother showed to you, preferring you before her father, so much I challenge that I may profess due to the more my lord, that I did love the more to live with him, made my downright violence and storm of fortunes may trumpet to the world, my heart subdued even to the very quality of my lord. I saw Othello's visage in my mind, and to his honours and his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. So that, my dear lords, if I be left behind, a moth of peace, and he go to the war, the rights for which I love him are bereft me, and I a heavy interim shall support by his dear absence. Let me go with him. He seems self-conscious, M11, 100%. Whereas Desdemona, here, as Iago contradicts, but as Othello asks her to, speaks up to the court and says, I'm torn here. I owe you as my father for my life and education, but this is my husband. Like my mother with you, I choose my husband over my father, as I'm meant to. The more my lord, interesting, my lord, so she submits to him, but she calls him the more still. So is she still a product of this prejudiced society? That I did love the more to live with him, my downright violence and storm of fortunes made trumpet to the world. So this idea of her love being violent, being a storm, right? Perhaps is this foreshadowing of its destructive quality? Yes. But also this idea of I love the more to live with him and everything that entails. She wants to live with the more biblically. She wants to have sex with him. She wants to marry him. She wants to have children with him. So she is professing this in front of her father in the court. This is pretty transgressive. My heart subdued, so my heart gives into anything he wants. Again, power dynamic. Is this perhaps fated that she becomes his victim? Possibly. I saw Othello's visage. I saw his face in my mind, and to his honours and his bravery, I consecrated myself in marriage. Myself, my soul, and my fortune, so my fate, I put in his hands, in other words, in marriage. Again, foreshadowing, perhaps. The rights for which I love him bereft me. So if we're separated, then I'm not being a good wife. I want to go with him. I can't serve him the way a good wife should. Similarly, when Emilia asks, is he not jealous? Desdemona says, who? He? Almost incredulously. I think the sun from when he was born drew all such humours from him. So the sun was so hot where he grew up that it took away any jealousy. It burnt it away from him. Interesting again, right? Because firstly, she cannot conceive of the fact that he would be jealous. She thinks he's above that. But secondly, there's still this idea of race in play here, because she's saying that the sun was so hot where he was born that it drew from him. So the idea of difference here is still apparent in the way she speaks to him as different from her, as coming from somewhere different, that he's not imbued with the same human quality of jealousy. Othello, when he's questioning Desdemona, when he's suspicious, says this argues fruitfulness and liberal heart. This is her hand as he takes her hand. He's saying it's hot and sweaty, and this suggests that you are kind of fertile and willingly loving. Hot, hot and moist. This hand of yours requires a sequester from liberty, fasting and prayer, must castigation, exercise devout. For here's a young and sweating devil here that commonly rebels. 'Tis a good hand, a frank one. Desdemona says, you may indeed say so, for 'twas the hand that gave away my heart. So he's saying here, your hand is revealing that you are sinning and that you're evil. This interest in palm reading perhaps is Shakespeare playing on stereotypes of the time of palmistry and fortune telling and all of these pagan rites, because Othello is from somewhere else. And he's saying your hand is revealing to me the fact that you need to be praying, fasting, and making right. And Desdemona says, well, yeah, it's the hand I gave you. So, in other words, it is a rebellious hand because I was the one it gave away my heart to you. And maybe it shouldn't have done. I think she's quite teasing here, right? She's not saying, and I regret it. She's saying, yes, it was the one that gave my heart away to you. So clearly it's passionate and full of desire. And Desdemona says as well, later when she's speaking to Emilia, heaven keep the monster from Othello's mind. So it's very obvious here. She doesn't view the monster as innate or inherent to Othello. She doesn't view him as monstrous. She views this external influence of jealousy, or whoever she thinks is causing this jealousy. She doesn't know it's Iago. But she's saying, keep it away from him. Don't let it prey on him. Even in Act 5, Scene 2, when she says, "And yet I fear you, for you're fatal then when your eyes roll so." This is the first time she said she fears him. She's been confused by him, etc. She is saying, you are, there's something life and death in you right now. Your eyes roll so. She's pointing out that his eyes are rolling like someone out of control, like someone who's possessed almost. So again, she seems confused as to why having done nothing, he is so brutal with her now. 11, maybe for her he was exotic in a way, not seeing him as a human having good or bad qualities, but just proof of another opinion. Interesting. Yeah, I would say there is some kind of Orientalism happening here, to quote Edward Said. She is perhaps projecting something onto him, some other that she wants, some view of him that she has concocted in her mind, and she can't really see him as a human, perhaps. Interesting. And I would say you could definitely argue that. And Desdemona, when Emilia asks her, who has done this? She says, nobody, I myself. Now, this is much more meaningful to the Jacobeans because lying on your deathbed is sending you to hell immediately. So she is risking being sent to hell in order to preserve Othello from being condemned for her death. Farewell, commend me to my kind lord. So still, she doesn't view him as monstrous. She views him as my kind lord. Even though he has just killed her and she knows it was for nothing, she is forgiving him and thus seemingly is kind of elevated to this idealized being. Orkin says, Cassio the Florentine clearly loves and respects his general. Desdemona, also like Iago Venetian, not only loves Othello, but remains consistently in love with him throughout the play. Never, despite that to which she is subjected, he's hit her, he's accused her, he's called her a whore to her face in public, impugning either that love or her husband. So she never puts Othello's actions or her murder on her husband. She never changes her love for him. So in a way, again, she kind of transforms into this female power who transcends through this strength of her love. Coleridge says, though, it would argue a disproportionateness, a want of balance in Desdemona, the fact that she, in her own words, fell in love with a black person. Coleridge is blaming Desdemona here and saying that there must be something wrong with her, something evil about her that she would do this, because otherwise it's just so unacceptable. This could be used as a counter argument, right? So we could use Coleridge's to say, actually, that's not true. She's innocent. She knew what she was doing, but she's still innocent at the end. And she's only accused for loving her husband. And Lumba says Desdemona's desire is especially transgressive because its object is black. So not only the fact that she has desire at all. Remember, women are supposed to be passive objects of affection, not active pursuers of affection. So the fact that she has desire at all is already transgressive, and especially because its object is black. Then we have Othello becoming the Jacobean stereotype, as I said. So firstly, Othello talking about the handkerchief. That handkerchief did an Egyptian to my mother give. She was a charmer and could almost read the thoughts of people. And it was dyed in mummy, which the skillful conserved of maiden's heart. So interestingly here, this inclusion, because we're thinking about Othello as believing in witchcraft and believing in mind readers and that kind of thing. So though he is now Christian, falling into, when he's into suspicion, this idea of being able to read minds or tell palms again, and believing in this magic handkerchief. Again, the Jacobean stereotype, tearing her to pieces. Oh, blood, blood, blood. This is the savage, brutal, bestial Moor that Iago, Brabantio, and Roderigo present. Othello says, even so, my bloody thoughts with violent pace shall ne'er look back, shall ne'er ebb to humble love, till that a capable and wide revenge swallows them up. So think about this when linked to the geographical history of Africa from Leo Africanus. The black Africans are very proud and high-minded and wonderfully addicted to wrath. This idea that the stereotype thus is being fulfilled at the time. He wants revenge and can't go back to love until revenge has swallowed all of his bloody thoughts. Desdemona also says, why, sweet Othello, he calls her devil and strikes her. And Ludovico says, my lord, this would not be believed in Venice. So this idea that Othello is out of control, and that especially when we think about Ludovico saying later, is this the same noble Moor who the whole of Venice supports? This idea that Othello has become someone unrecognizable from his normal self. And Iago also says, he foams at the mouth and by breaks out to savage madness. This is Othello narrating for us Othello having an epileptic fit on stage when seeing Desdemona and Cassio together. Epileptic fits at the time would have been associated with being possessed by the devil. He didn't have the understanding of epilepsy being a condition that we would today. So this idea of foaming at the mouth and breaking out to savage madness is this idea of him being possessed by devilry, driven to madness, becoming a devil himself. There's lots of biblical descriptions of people with epilepsy having devils inside them that need to be driven out. However, it's actually Iago bringing out this devilry and thus suggesting that it's innate, right? It's not that a devil has flown into Othello, unless we think of Iago as that devil. And Iago is saying, oh, look, I brought it out. Othello says as well, all my fond love, thus do I blow to heaven, 'tis gone. Arise, black vengeance, from the hollow hell. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate. Swell bosom with thy fraught, for 'tis of aspics tongues. So he's saying, get up. And notice black vengeance. There's again this stereotype. He's associating his own self. He's calling for blackness within himself. And by that he means evil and vengeance. He's saying, come up from hell. Turn all of my goodness and love to hate. It's full of aspics tongue. So it's full of, evil ingredients, in other words. He's sending away his love. He's turned to revenge. He becomes devilish. He's calling it up. It's almost as if he's calling up devilry, just like perhaps Lady Macbeth. Othello also says, damn her, lewd minx. Oh, damn her, damn her. Notice here he's calling for damnation for her. Come, go with me apart. I will withdraw to furnish me with some swift means of death for the fair devil. Now thou art my lieutenant. So here talking about planning her death. And so this is premeditated murder then. This is something he's intending to do. Othello also says, pish, noses, ears and lips. Is it possible? This is a kind of swearing and incoherence that we've heard with Iago before. Confess, handkerchief, oh devil, oh fire and brimstone. Fire and brimstone is something Iago says as well, and it's a curse. So Othello is becoming like Iago, which is becoming evil, which is associated with blackness. It's kind of like he's calling out for the devil. And I highlighted the M dashes here because this, again, speaks to his incoherence. So this is this kind of broken language that would be the Jacobean stereotype. Emilia, after Desdemona's death, O gull, O dolt. So, as ignorant as dirt, the Moor hath killed my mistress, murder, murder, the villainy, villainy, villainy. I think upon it, I think I smell it, O villainy. I thought so then, I'll kill myself for grief, O villainy, villainy. Villainy being linked to evil, of course, but also being linked to the lower class. So Emilia is saying, not only are you evil, you are low. You've been cast low, and we'll get to this just in a moment as well when we get back to the title. He says you're as ignorant as dirt. So again, we have this idea of blackness being associated with ignorance and evil, and villainy being something that is taking over Othello so much that one can smell it. Orkin says the most fiendish character polluted by language so gross, so very different from some of the other critics. A general tendency to see Africa as the barbarism against which European civilization defined itself. So this is the othering that we said, and as M11 supported as well, this prejudice of the Jacobeans. Orkin also says Elizabethan Englishmen saw the natives of Africa as barbarous, treacherous, libidinous, and jealous. Does Othello embody all of these things here? Barbarous, treacherous, libidinous, which means sexualized, lustful, and jealous? Yes. So this would be fulfilling the Jacobean stereotype. Orkin also says Shakespeare is writing both about and to his countrymen's feelings concerning physical distinctions between people. So he's writing about and to people who are othering others. Neil describes this play confirms the deep fears of racial sexual otherness on which the play trades. Neil also says, in a 19th century Russian literary lady's account, the play exhibits nothing less than the symbolic rape of the European spirit by the savage, wild flesh of black otherness. That's not my misspelling, that's the misspelling from the account. But this idea of England and Europe being contaminated and destroyed and violated by this. And D'Amico saying the contemporary audience would await a return to his barbarous self, and here we have it. What does the choice of tragic hero tell us? Well, Othello here is the protagonist of the play. Tragedy is, by definition in their genre, meant to bring someone high, born, low. We have that lowness because he is revealed as villainous, because he becomes monstrous, because, as Emilia says, ignorant as dirt, villain, villain. But that then implies and forces us to say that he was started off high class. He started off as high in power, high in society, which means that Shakespeare is forcing us to contend with the fact that Othello is powerful in society, and that black people can be powerful, respected, and human in society, and are worthy of being the protagonist of a tragedy. This also means that because of the genre of tragedy, we are meant to sympathize with the protagonist. So that means we are meant to sympathize with the black person. And thus, again, Shakespeare is forcing us to contend with the fact that otherwise, automatically, Jacobean sympathies would have been against Othello and would have assumed he was unsympathetic immediately and eternally. But Shakespeare is forcing us to think of him as sympathetic. This then organizes us into our arguments. I've presented you with 5 different lines of arguments, which then could be your different arguments across the play. So these would be your 5 arguments of the racism of the Venetians, capturing the prejudice of Jacobean society and embodying it. The characterization of Othello subverting contemporary views of blackness. Othello's own internalized racism as developing across the play and embodying the racism of the Venetians, which is why he perhaps falls into this descent. We could look slightly off kilter of centre at Desdemona's own view of Othello's race as something that is, again, subversive for the time. And then we can view him as his trajectory by the end is becoming that stereotype and fulfilling it. Okay. That brings us to the end of our lecture. We have gone over a little bit. Apologies for that. It's just so much to talk about with this theme that it requires a little bit of extra time. Thank you to everyone who participated. Thank you to everyone who's joined. Please feel free to follow me, Eleanor Does English, as I will be putting out much more content on Othello and many more of the texts that you know and love for A-level. and hope to see you on our next lesson, which will be on Wednesday again at 6:50 until 8:20. Thank you very much for your attention and see you next time. Bye for now.